This is what rich people do with their broken bait casters. If you're seeing this video on your For You page, you probably fish. You're gonna wanna save this video because I'm gonna show you guys how to repair this. This reel is obviously not supposed to spin in both directions. The anti-reverse bearing went out. I'm just gonna give you a couple of examples of how this can screw you up in a tournament. Say you are fishing a chatterbait and your hand is not on that reel and you go to pop that chatterbait out of grass and your handle spins backwards, you're gonna get a backlash. You're gonna ball up, or say you're fishing a chatterbait and you go to lean into a fish and your hand is not on that reel's gonna spin backwards. You're gonna get a backlash and you're going to lose that fish. So I'm just gonna show you how to replace this. This is a very simple fix. Anybody can do it. Just a few screws. You just gotta be careful because the parts are small, so you wanna have something that you can put those parts on. I'm gonna go step by step, show you exactly how to replace it. This is a Shimano SLX DC. The anti is obviously blown out, but I'm actually going to do an anti-reverse bearing in this Shimano Curado MGL 150 HG. Like I said, it's a very common issue. I've used all reels and eventually this bearing does go out. Now, one thing with this reel, as you can see, it's not spinning backwards. This is a reel where it's happening every once in a while. It's very intermittent, so you don't want to take the chance, guys. I have lost big fish in tournaments when money's on the line, bank fishing, whatever. You don't want to take the chance. If you're getting signs that your reel's starting to spin backwards, just replace the bearing. I'm going to show you the video now. We're going to do it in the Shimano, but it's very similar in a Luz, Abu Garcia. I mean, all across the board, most reels, they all have a side plate, they all have a spool, and all of the anti-reverse bearings are typically right here in this handle area. So we're gonna show you how to replace it. Your reels, they all come with a schematic sheet. On that schematic sheet, you're gonna see that bearing. Here you're gonna see there's gonna be a part number on that schematic sheet, and you're gonna contact your reel company and they're gonna send you that part. So first things first is we're gonna move this side plate right here to remove the spool. So most of these reels will have a latch similar to this one right here where you remove the side plate to take your spool out. I'm gonna assume most of you know how to remove the spool out of your fishing reel. So we're gonna go ahead and remove this spool. I have replaced literally hundreds of these. I try to do them every 6 months to a year on my personal builds because it's a very important part and it's crucial, especially if you're competitive fishing. Now that the spool is gone, our next step is to remove the handle. I'm gonna assume that most of you know how to change the handles out. A lot of guys upgrade their handles, their knobs, whatever. So we're gonna go ahead and take the handle out. Typically there's a screw right here, either flathead or a Phillips. This is gonna be a Phillips. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab my Phillips screwdriver, loosen up this screw. And then there's a cap over the nut. We're gonna go ahead, remove that. This is a righty reel, so we're gonna loosen to the left. On a lefty reel, we're actually loosening going to the right, so remember that. So we're gonna go ahead and loosen up this nut, crack it loose, and crack it loose, and then we're gonna do the rest with my hand. And I'm gonna hold the handle in place. I'm gonna take that nut off, and now, before I remove this handle, I'm gonna put my thumb on this star drag right here, just because there is a spring underneath that and I don't want that to pop. That's an important step. Make sure you put pressure holding this star drag down. Now I'm gonna remove my handle, put my handle down, and now another thing, underneath this black washer right here, there's a small click pin and a spring. You're gonna also put your finger on that washer to prevent the click pin and the spring from coming up. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna remove this complete assembly. I'm gonna put that down. There's that spring that I was talking about. That's what we were holding the tension down. We can remove the spring. And this right here is the nut that's tightened down on your spring washers, which is actually part of the drag system. So I'm gonna go ahead and back this nut off. And again, every single reel that you buy is gonna come with a schematic sheet. So if you forget how the parts go back together, just look at that schematic sheet. It literally has arrows of how everything is sandwiched back together. And a majority of these reels, they really are the same. So some guys will put their parts in order of how they took it apart. I've done so many of them, I don't do that anymore. I'm just gonna make sure that we're not gonna lose these parts. I'm gonna put them on this paper towel. All right, there's my first spring washer. There's another one. And And there's another little washer underneath that. Okay, so the next step is there are normally 2 screws on this end, on this side, on the outside of this side plate where the handle is, and then there's normally 1 or 2 on the back side of the side plate. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen those up. I know that there's 4 on this reel, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to loosen those up, and then this side plate is going to come off, and that's actually going to expose that bearing. Sometimes some of these screws are different lengths, so just pay attention to where you're taking them out from. If one is longer than the other, just try to remember where you get the longer screw from. Again, if you don't remember, look at that schematic sheet. That's going to tell you how to do it. Well, typically the ones here on the inside of the side plate are a different thread type and a different length. And there you go, right there. You see that that one's a little bit longer, and it's a completely different thread pattern than these 2 screws right here. So I'm going to know that the way that I look, just the way that my mind works, I see HG right here. So in my head, I'm like, okay, long screw, weird thread, HG up at the top over here. That's just the way that my mind works. I'm going to take this one out below it, and I'm just going to put that right below it. Oh, those 2 are the same. If you try to put these 2 screws on the outside, they won't work because the threads are different. So now I'm going to go ahead and take the side plate off. It's just going to come up. Make sure that this shaft right here is pointing up when you take this side plate off right here. So we're going to take it off, and we're going to be nice and careful, and nothing's going to pop out if you do this nice and slow. And there you go. We're not doing anything here. This is a fairly new reel. We're not servicing the reel today. We're just changing this out. We'll do another video down the road where we're actually servicing these reels, where we're greasing these gears and whatnot, and the drag washers. But today we're just going to replace the anti. So the anti is actually in this place, in this plate right here. So we're going to prop this up so that nothing falls over, just like that. So when you open up this side plate, you're going to see this piece right here. This is your sleeve. Every reel has a sleeve. This is what the anti-reverse bearing, which is right there, rides on. So that's kind of how it fits, just like that. But when I do the assembly, you'll actually see that we're actually going to put this sleeve back on here, and there's a little groove. On specific models, there's a groove. On some of them, they don't have that groove, and we're just going to make sure that that fits right there in that groove. So now all we have to do is pop this anti-reverse bearing. This anti-reverse bearing only goes in one way. In this specific model, it's going to come out this way, so I'm going to have to hit it from the outside of the reel, but I'm going to have to remove this bearing. Some of these reels have this bearing, some of them don't. Literally, you could just grab a flathead and just be very easy. You don't want to be too rough with this. It'll pop right out just like that. So now that I could see part of my anti-reverse bearing from the outside of the shell, I know that it needs to be knocked from the top side here. Guys, some guys will say, oh, clean it. You know, I've left them in alcohol for 24 hours, 48 hours. I've tried lighter fluid. I've tried everything to leave them soak and then re-lube them, but they end up just going out. The parts are typically between $15 and $30 to replace that bearing. So I just started really replacing the bearings just because I feel like I get more life out of a brand new bearing. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna lay the side plate flat on the table just like that, and I'm gonna grab a flathead and I'm just gonna push down. So sometimes they'll break freely like that. In case they don't, you just get a pin like this and you can go ahead and tap it with a hammer. But again, not too hard, you wanna be very gentle. Fortunately, that one slid right out. So what I'm gonna do now is replace this bearing. This is our bad bearing. And I'm gonna grab my replacement that we got from Shimano. From my experience, Shimano, Abu Garcia, Luz, Ardent, a majority of these bigger reel companies, Daiwa, they have these parts readily available if you contact them directly. If not, there's plenty of e-replacement websites for all kinds of reels, all manufacturers. And then sometimes even if you contact a bearing company direct and tell them the size and the dimensions, they'll have that bearing as well. So I've never really had an issue getting these bearings. So this is the new bearing. As you can see, it's the same part. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to install this bearing. Now, you have to remember that this is a one-way bearing, so it's only supposed to spin one way. So depending on a left-hand retrieve or a right-hand retrieve, it's going to make a difference on how you install this bearing. Try to be mindful and remember which direction this anti-reverse bearing was put into this side plate, because this bearing, for example, is universal and will work on a left-hand reel and a right-hand reel, but it's going to depend on whatever side that handle is on. You have to pay attention to the orientation of this bearing where it was sitting in that side plate. So on this specific reel, there is text on this anti-reverse bearing, and I know that the text was facing downwards inside of the side plate. So I'm going to go ahead, make sure that text is facing downwards. This is a right-hand retrieve reel, and I'm going to use my thumb, and I'm just going to push that bearing in there just like that. It'll stop, and it's going to sit flush right here. Just add 1 drop of oil. This is Shimano Bantam oil, which will work because this is the same. This MGL anti-reverse is the same exact anti-reverse that works in a Shimano Bantam as well. Very similar build. So I'm gonna go ahead and just add 1 drop. That's plenty. You don't wanna do grease. Next thing, from the outside, I'm just gonna reverse that whole process. I'm gonna pop this bearing in like this. I'm gonna go ahead and grab this part of the reel, and I'm gonna go ahead and install my side plate. So I'm just gonna carefully, I put my sleeve in, I made sure that's in those notches, sitting flush, and I'm gonna go ahead and sandwich these two together, and I'm gonna hold them in place, make sure everything is flush, and I'm gonna go ahead and start by putting in the longer screws in from the inside of the side plate. Normally, once I get a second screw in there, I don't have to hold it and sandwich them together anymore. So I'm gonna get this screw in. Now, one thing, before you put everything together, I'm guilty of this, I've made this mistake before. I will always check and just make sure that the reel is spinning in the correct direction, because it is possible that you put that bearing in there backwards, pop it out, reverse it, flip it, put it back in, and you're good to go. So as you can see, this is a right-hand retrieve reel. It's only spinning one direction. It's in the correct way. Now, I'm just reversing everything I did before, putting this washer back on. I'm putting these 2 drag washers back on. These are important because you don't ever want them to sit flush on top of each other. You always want them to create a gap. And I'm going to show you that in a second. You can see that gap right there. So when I go ahead and put this washer back down on there and then the nut, that's actually going to create the tension, that gap right there. Again, the orientation that you put this stuff back together is super important. Like this nut, for example, has a groove for that spring that I was talking about earlier. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this is the nut that actually controls the drag. So I'm tightening the drag right now. I'm gonna go ahead and put the spring back in. Now, when I reinstall this star assembly, your drag assembly, if you look from the inside, it has a square shape. Well, it's actually an octagon, and it is the same exact shape as this, and this sits inside of that. So you want to look at the orientation of how this is and how this piece is, and that's going to sit just like that on top. So we got it sitting flush. We're holding onto this washer right here so that click pin and the spring doesn't pop out. We're going to hold that in place, and now we're going to put our handle back on. I'm going to put the handle back on. We're going to reinstall our nut. Again, this is a righty reel, so righty-tighty. If this was a lefty reel, we'd be going the opposite direction. You're actually tightening it going left on a lefty reel. That's the proper way to use these things anyways for us righties. So there's 2 more screws for my side plate. I'm going to go ahead and put those in. Go ahead and put those final 2 screws on the side plate from the outside. These are the smaller ones. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is tighten down this nut. For those of you that have never removed a handle before, it's smart to drop a drop of Loctite on this nut, just because that's another very crucial thing when using a bait caster is you don't want this to get loose and fall off and that nut come off and you're fishing and now you lose the nut, you lose everything, and you got nothing to hold the handle on. This reel is as good as being in the trash when you're out fishing a tournament and that happens. So I'm gonna go ahead and tighten down this nut, which we already had some Loctite in there from before, and I'm gonna tighten it down. And I'm not gonna go completely tight yet, but I'm gonna make sure it's nice and snug. Now, on this nut, you can see on the side plate right here, there are grooves, and those grooves will only sit a certain way, but we need to make sure that this hole matches up with the hole on the handle so that I can put my final screw in there. So I got lucky that time, the nut's on there snug, that's fitting, that my hole is exposed, so I'm gonna go ahead and put my last screw in, tighten that down. There's Loctite on that screw as well, and now I can go ahead and tighten my drag. So I'm tightening down my drag. There you go. Only spins in one direction, nice and smooth. Everything feels great. I'm gonna go ahead and put my spool back in. This is fluorocarbon. You wanna be really careful when you're putting your spool back in, especially if you wanna save this line, because when you close this side plate and you crimp that fluorocarbon, it's gonna be another break off. So I'll normally like hold the fluorocarbon here, like you can see I'm doing with my middle finger. And as I put the spool in, I want to keep tension on the line from the front. And kind of, now I can see that there's no way that line's going to get crimped. And it's just going to pop in just like that. The line's not crimped, it's not damaged. I'm going to go ahead and close my side plate and flip that switch to closed again. So test my drag. Drag feels good. Tighten it some more. It's working. It's great. It's smooth. I'm going to back it off a little bit just for now, but that right there is how you change the anti-reverse bearing and a lot of headaches in your bait casting reel. Don't throw it away.